17's Department of Politics and Prose. Thank you for joining us and tuning in to this virtual format where we continue to bring authors and new books to you. I have the pleasure of hosting our event this evening, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome our guests, Rex Ogle, in conversation with Deborah D. Taylor to celebrate the publication of Abuela, Don't Forget Me, the companion memoir in verse to Free Lunch and Punching Bag. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. If you would like to have closed captioning for this event, please look at the bottom of your screen and click on Live Transcript and then select Show Subtitle. You can click the link we will drop in the chat to get your own copy of Abuela, Don't Forget Me. We'll also include links for Free Lunch and Punching Bag. Lastly, if you have a question for our guests, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add one there. At the end of the presentation, our guests will have time to answer some of your questions. Now on to introductions. Rex Ogle has written and edited hundreds of books and comics for children and young adults. His verse and memoir, Free Lunch, was the winner of the 2020 YALSA Excellence in Nonfiction Award. Born and raised mostly in Texas, he moved to New York City where he worked for several publishers as an editor. He currently lives in Los Angeles where he writes full-time. Deborah D. Taylor, a politics and prose contributing moderator, retired from the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore, Maryland. She has chaired and served on many American Library Association committees and on the National Book Awards jury for Young People's Literature. She was named the 2015 recipient of the Coretta Scott King Virginia Hamilton Award for Lifetime Achievement. She is a reviewer and currently serves as the chair of the Ezra Jack Keats Awards Committee. And it is now my pleasure to turn the event over to them.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be back talking with Rex. So much enjoyed Abuela, Don't Forget Me, and can't wait to talk about all the different things I learned about you. And despite this being the third book about your coming of age, we learn all kinds of new things about you. Was this book, did the first two books make this one easier or harder to write?
I think that the first book was the hardest thing I ever wrote. Free Lunch was a very difficult process. Having that come out of me was emotional. It was hard. It was anxiety provoking. It was difficult. I thought that was hard. And then I wrote Punching Bag, which was probably 10 times harder. So by the time I got to Abuela, Don't Forget Me, it felt natural for it to come out, but also I was writing it in verse, and writing something in verse is, it's much tighter, but it's that much more impactful because you only have so many words to come out with something. So it was a completely different animal. I also, when I started writing this was a love letter to my grandmother. And as it came out of me, it just felt like I wasn't writing it for a book. I wasn't writing it for anybody but her. So it was very, very different.
Was that always your intention? You said it came out of you as a love letter, but did you always feel like you wanted in some way to show the kind of woman she was and the impact she'd had on your life?
I did. My whole life, I've thought she was such an incredible, amazing woman, coming from where she came from, Mexico with 13 brothers and sisters, living in extreme poverty, to the point that it made my life look pretty good by comparison. Free Lunch, I talk about how difficult my life was, but then I look at her life and I think it's so much more difficult than mine. So I always, there was part of me that always wanted to write a book about her. I never thought that I would be able to write an entire book about her. Mm-hmm. But when she developed dementia a few years ago, she started forgetting a lot of things. At first it was small things, and then they got bigger and bigger. And I would, bring up old stories, and she would, have this vacant look in her eyes. And that's about the time I started writing stuff down. I wanted her to remember, but I wanted it to be easy for her to read, easy for her to access. So instead of writing really huge, long stories, I decided to write it in verse. So when I was writing them just for her. I never had an intention to make it into a book until much later. in the process. But yeah, it was always my intention for it to be a love letter to her because she was such an incredible woman, and she did so much for me. She did so much for our family. She did so much for strangers. I would love to sing her praise all the time.
You know, the first poem, you're 4 years old, I think, and then you bring it up to the present. What do you want readers to understand about the events over that long a time span?
I mean, the story is very much our interaction. I tried to weave in as much as I knew about her, as many stories that she told me. You know, I try to put all of that in there. I wish it, you know, the original title was all about my grandmother, but it wasn't all about my grandmother. It was about both of us. So I changed it. I changed the title. But oh my gosh, I just lost the question. What was the question? Oh wait, no, I remember it now. Um, Going from age 4 to the present day was something I just wanted to cover everything. I wanted to start with my first memory of her. I wanted to go down the line and show how, you know, there was a tug and a pull and a push, and it, you know, things went back and forth like the tides of an ocean. It was very much a beautiful relationship, but one that, you know, it had its tension as well. There were things that we went through together. There were things that we went through apart, but they affected us. And it was very important, I think, to cover so much ground in as little time as possible, because it's important, I think, that a lot of people have their grandmothers for a short period of time or for a long period of time. So it's good to show how the relationships grow, how they change, how they evolve. And to be honest, I could have written more. I could have gone on and on. There's so many stories that I have about her. And even after I finished writing the book, I came up with more ideas. And I was like, why did I never talk about how much she loved Pepsi? She loved Pepsi.
That's a great story in itself. One of the connecting stories throughout the narrative is your visits to Jason's house whenever you spent time with your abuela. Why was it important to include them throughout this piece?
You know, I think there was something about, I had a lot more poems originally, and my editor helped me cut back because we wanted to focus just on the relationship between me and my grandmother. The Jason chapters, I think, were important because it was across the street. It was something that it showed how time changes, how time evolves, how people, you know, come in and out of your life. And I wanted to put that in there to show that Catalina, my abuela, was always in my life. I wanted to show that lots of people, you know, came into my life, they played a part, and then they left my life, but she was always there. So I thought it was a nice juxtaposition between the two to have Jason across the street. It also showed how going to her house was something of a vacation for me. You know, it was always a safe space. And so to be able to cross the street and have a good friend was a nice thing until it wasn't anymore.
And it's so much, in a literary fashion, so much richer to have that, you know, show up from time to time than to just say, you know, things change. You know, things weren't always the same when I would visit my abuela. So, but I just found it just such a rich way of telling that part of the story.
Yeah, thank you.
As great as the relationship was between the two of you, that, as you alluded to earlier, there were some moments of tension. Can you describe what those moments were like and how they both helped your relationship grow, or were things that you just had to work through?
You know, one of the things I wish I'd spend a little more time on is when I was probably around 4th or 5th grade, when I started to realize that the way she talked was different from the way other people talked. It never occurred to me that having an accent, a thick accent, was something that other people frowned upon. I mean, keep in mind, this was Texas in the 80s, and, you know, Hispanics were still frowned upon. They were still looked as a lesser people. They were our workers. They were our janitors. They were our restaurant workers. They weren't seen in politics. They weren't seen as big figures. They weren't seen on TV. So for my grandmother to have that thick accent, you know, I think it was embarrassing. And I didn't know to be embarrassed about it until other kids my age met her and started making fun of it. And it was really horrible of me looking back to be embarrassed of such a small thing. And I think growing up, it only lasted probably up until high school. Then I was no longer embarrassed of her. I had other things to be embarrassed about. But there was definitely a tension because I think she knew that I was embarrassed, and I think that it hurt her feelings, and rightfully so. But by the time I got to high school, I had let that go. But the other tension was just my relationship with my mom, her relationship with my mom, the abuse that was there. And her house was a safe space from it, even though my mom many times, would try to bring that in, to drag it across the doorstep. So there was always this tension, underlying tension, that Catalina couldn't protect me as much as she wanted to. And there were times when I knew she was doing her best. And then there were times like my senior year in high school when I was devastated that she had invited it back into her house because she thought I was doing drugs. I know that she had good intentions, but ultimately it resulted in a very bad outcome. And we didn't talk for a while because of that, even living under the same roof. But I look back on that time and I'm so glad that we got over it, because she's always been such a magnificent force in my life.
How would you describe her relationship with her own children and her family back in Mexico? There's a wonderful scene when you go, and so how would you describe that? What do you think that meant to her? Both of those relationships.
Her relationship with her kids, I think, started off well enough, but as she got older, it became strained, especially with my mother. She had two of my aunts who were always very wonderful to her, the oldest and the youngest, and then the two boys who were in the middle were kind of here and there. Sometimes there was tension, sometimes there wasn't. And then there was my mom, who was a nightmare straight out of the gate and was always causing problems. I think my grandmother did the best that she could with my mom, but my mom was a complete and utter handful. I could tell you a dozen stories about my mom, and I could tell 100 stories about how my mom just railed against her own mother. And it wasn't violent, but it was definitely verbally abusive. She was just so down on her all the time. And I never understood that relationship. And I still to this day don't quite understand it, except to think, that my mom is, mentally ill. I mean, she's never been able to have a healthy relationship with me or my brother. And it's always been a sore spot that I feel like an orphan, even though my mom is still alive. As for Catalina's relationship with her family, I think that was always a very good relationship. Growing up, I think they grew up in extreme poverty. I don't think her parents were always the nicest, but I think they did their best. And I think she recognized that, at least she did as an adult. She would tell me that, if she acted up, like her mom would take a spoon and whack. And that's something that I could relate to with my own mom. But she had nothing but love for her family back in Mexico. And so for that trip, when we went to Mexico, it was such a wonderful moment because she was so proud to have me as her grandson and to introduce me around. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I just look back on it and I wish that I had more of that in my childhood, because my mom prevented me from having a lot of that. And it was devastating because this is my heritage. This is something that I wanted to connect with. And this is something that my mom did not want me to.
What drove her? What were other folks in Abuela's family also go to get degrees and do some of the things that she did? Or what do you think drove her? Because she just seemed to have accomplished such a lot. You talk about the poverty, you talk about coming from such a large family, the language is, just all of those things, but gosh, she accomplished a lot.
She did. She was an amazing woman. I mean, she grew up with next to nothing, dirt floors, no running water. She lost two of her siblings to something I think it was probably the flu. Like they just needed Tylenol or an aspirin to bring their fevers down, and she lost them both to that. So there was a lot of just extenuating circumstances. I think for her, she wanted to make her life better. And I think she wanted to make her life better, not just for herself, but for her siblings. Because when she came over to Mexico, she married a military person so he was able to provide for their family, but she continued working 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 jobs, dry cleaning and mending outfits and, housekeeping and anything she could do to raise money. And she would send that money back to Mexico. She put her twin brother through medical school, which still blows my mind that there are doctors in my family that came from Mexico, that came from similar circumstances. I think her drive was just, she always wanted something better for herself and for her family. And she strove. I mean, I don't think when she passed away that she had a dime in her bank account because she gave it all away. She was always, saving up money for my education and for my brother's education, my cousin's education. She made sure that all 5 of her kids went to college, with the exception of my mom, who dropped out her first year because she wanted to have a baby with my dad. And it was funny because my dad was also like, no, you need to finish college before we have a kid. But my mom was really focused on having a kid. She didn't want to go to college. So of everyone in the family, she's the only one who doesn't have a college degree. Which I think really, again, hurt my grandmother's feelings, because she wanted everyone to have an education and to make themselves better. She always spoke about how much she loved the United States and about how this was an amazing country that gave her so many opportunities. And it's funny because growing up, I didn't feel that. I grew up, I guess, a little bit spoiled. Yes, there is a lot lacking in America, but I think when you come from Mexico with next to nothing, you look at America and you're like, wow, there's a lot of great stuff going on here.
As we mentioned her being married to a military man, some of the humor came up with the two of you going to purchase things on the at the commissary, I think.
Yeah.
So you saw the moments where her frugality and her ability to make those purchases, it turned into a little bit of humor. So that's really something that's very enjoyable there.
Thank you. Yeah, she was a very frugal person. She cut coupons. She made sure to always buy things on sale. She always shopped at the commissary because it was tax-free. For her, it was all about saving nickels and dimes here and there to either send to her family, to send to me, to save up for my college. She was always very cognizant of money.
Yet she was very willing to buy things for you that you wanted. That it was like she didn't let her frugality stand in the way of the pleasure of being able to see you, enjoy something at the same time.
She definitely spoiled me. I mean, I remember Legos. I loved Legos as a kid, and Legos are expensive. Legos are not a cheap toy. But she bought me the first few sets that I ever owned, and they were amazing. And it's something that I played with again and again. And it was something that brought me so much joy. And I think she saw that. And so for her, I think she was making up for her childhood when she didn't have toys. And she definitely spoiled her grandkids when she could. Not to a massive degree, but enough to let us know that she cared for our happiness.
When you have more than one grandchild, was there something special about your relationship? I don't want to say that you were a favorite or anything, but was there some connection? Sometimes you can have family members that, you have complementary energy or something. I'm not sure what the term would be, but there's something about that connection. Do you think that was something that you experienced with her?
I think we had a very special connection. I think part of it was that I was her first grandson. So for, I think, 3 years, I was the baby. I was the only one in the family. And I just think we had such a special rapport. And maybe she said it to all her grandkids, but I mean, she would pull me aside and tell me that I was her favorite. So that was always a nice feeling. But she never treated anyone better or worse than the others. If we went out to eat, she'd make sure that everything was fair and fair. Everything was split evenly. She wanted us to love each other and not to one up each other.
Right.
And she was very good at making sure that we all felt loved and that all of us were special.
Isn't that a special gift, though, to have that, to be able to do that with family members? You can have a special connection, but you can treat everyone equally, or that you can make sure that everybody feels a part of what's going on.
Yeah, she was an amazing woman, and she not only took care of me, but she took care of so many other people. She volunteered at prisons teaching inmates how to read, and she taught them English. She would go to courts and she would help translate. She would go to old folks' homes and, help feed them, and go to homeless shelters and feed them. I mean, she was always going. And some of the stuff she was paid for and some of the stuff she wasn't. But she always had it in her heart to help other people. And that always just amazed me about her.
There is a great passage, really poignant moment in the book involving a journal that she purchased for you. I don't know if you have it handy.
I do.
It's on page 111. I would love it if you could read a little bit, those last few paragraphs.
Yeah,
of that
absolutely.
Poem, especially when it becomes later mom will discover it. Maybe start from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep in mind, for the readers who haven't read it, my grandmother buys a journal for me. Later, mom will discover it, this secret between her mother and her son, because we belong to her. And she will riot and shout, throwing the book at me, screaming, "Why would you spend $20 on a book with no words in it?" When I scream back, "Because I want to put my words in it." Her fist will meet my jaw in front of Abuela, who will clutch her own face as though she were struck. While Abuela cries quietly, begging my mom not to hit me again, I will shout, "These are my words. They matter. Hit me all you want. I will write." These are my words. They do matter. And she did hit me, all she wanted. But I wrote, and I still write. I will always write. No one can stop me from writing. My words are mine, with the voice given to me by my Abuela.
Yeah, I thought that was extremely special and really showed the roots of your writing in a way, and how she enabled that part of you to grow.
She always encouraged me to write. She was always there for me, pushing me, telling me that what I wanted to do was worthwhile. She never had a negative word to say. Even when I was struggling, I moved to New York City and was working in editor jobs and not making a lot of money. And I always was writing on the side. And my grandmother just said, keep at it, keep at it. She's like, if this is what you want to do, then you should do it. And I think she saw the value in that. She always said you could be out doing drugs, you could be out partying, you could always be out causing problems or in jail. She's like, but if you choose to write, she's like, that is a hobby that I can support.
And why do you think your mother was so against you learning Spanish?
That's an excellent question. I think it comes down to hate. I think that my mother, like me in middle school, when I discovered that my grandmother had an accent and that other kids were making fun of me for it, I think that my mom grew up with that. She grew up with having a mom, and this was in the 60s, I guess. So this was 20 years earlier. This was in an America where Hispanics were definitely frowned upon and looked upon as second-class citizens. And I think my mom was embarrassed, and I think that she fought a lot with her mom. And so when she heard her mom speaking Spanish, she did not want to be associated with that. And so when I was growing up, she didn't want me speaking Spanish. And I don't know if I don't think she was trying to protect me. I think that would be giving her too much credit. I honestly think she just associated that with her own mother, and she didn't want me having a secret language with her mother. And I think that's how she felt about it. She didn't want us being able to communicate without her.
So it wasn't she wanted you to assimilate so much as she wanted to make sure that whatever you said, she could understand it, and it wouldn't be this kind of special, another bond between you and your grandmother.
Yes, 100%.
The summer well, before we go to that, speak about the time you spent living with Abuela. There was lots of discussion about going back and forth and visits. And then you you actually go and live with her and go to high school. It feels like such an important turning point.
It was an extremely amazing turning point because she got me to go to Junior Scholars, which was a college program designed for high schoolers between their junior and senior year. And that was in Abilene. And so it was a break for the summer to get away from my mom and my stepdad and the violence that occurred in that house. And when I went there, it was so amazing to be free of the violence and free of the mental abuse. And I think my grandmother saw that, and she didn't want that. I mean, she never wanted it for me. And so when she found that scholarship that said if I graduated from a local high school, that I could get a free ride or a full ride to one of the local colleges, we were all for it. We had to give it a chance. And so she invited me to come live with her. And it was such a huge turning point because it was the first time that I was free of so much negativity and so much violence. And I was able to just be myself. And I was able to go to school and have friends and, drive around and have a job and, make good grades without having to stress about going home to a household where I didn't know if I was going to be hit or smacked around or yelled at for an hour. And it was so beautiful. It was a beautiful gift that she gave me in doing that. Of course, it turned against us when she thought that I was doing drugs and my mom showed up and took my car. And I didn't speak to my grandmother for a while. And that was a mistake on my part because my grandmother, it was always her best intention for me to live a great life and to be a positive, healthy person. So when she was worried about the drugs, she was worried about the drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally understand. Looking back now, I'm like, I put her through hell. And I'm so apologetic for that. And she's known that. I apologized 100 times for it, but she got me out of abuse and she taught me freedom. And I can always thank her for that. I can always be grateful.
And why do you think, sometimes some folks, some young people have gone through so much by the time they get to high school that they couldn't really take advantage of that change. What do you think helped you take advantage of that change for that to be a real turning point?
I think that she had always pushed me to make good grades. She had always taught me to look forward to college. And these were things that my mom certainly didn't. My mom, many a times was saying, no one needs college. You don't need to go to college. College doesn't make you a better person,
Mm-hmm.
But Catalina was always pushing me. She was always saying, keep your eyes on the prize, focus on making good grades. You can make something of yourself if you just try, if you just focus, if you just look forward and be positive. And it was always the power of positive thinking with her. And that was something she would always try to instill in me. And even now I struggle with it. I grew up with a lot of trauma, and that's something that has sunk into me. And it's always been very hard. But I've always looked to her for inspiration because she was such a positive person. And I think it was that positivity that kept me focused on the prize of going to college.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of turning points, the summer you spent with your father seemed to signal another type of turning point. And I must admit, I was curious why you went.
I was obligated to go. I was too young to say no. When my parents got divorced, I was required to spend at least a week with my dad every year.
I see.
But honestly, I didn't even realize it at the time, but that was my abuela's machinations. She wanted me away from the abuse. She wanted me away from the violence. So she called my dad's parents and said, can he come live with you for the summer? And they were like, sure. So going up to Tennessee to stay with my dad's family was, again, it was just something that Catalina did to get me away from the abuse at home. She wanted me to have time away from the violence. She wanted me to have time away from trauma. And I mean, when I learned that, it was such an amazing thing because once again, she was being selfless, and my mom wouldn't let me go stay with her for the summer, but she wanted me to get away. And so she paid for me to go. And again, it was just another gift that I'm always grateful for.
So your mom was just not letting you go for that summer because she just didn't want you to have that time where you were, free and not having to worry about the trauma.
Right. And my dad talked her into it. He reminded her that he only got 1 week out of the year. So he was like, but his family didn't really know me at all. So he wanted me to go to Tennessee to get to know that side of the family. And she didn't object to that. So I was very lucky, but she never knew, or at least I don't think she ever knew, that Catalina paid for the plane tickets and everything.
Well, we've got a question from our audience, and this is from Sam O, and he'd like you to talk about your choice of writing in verse. I think you hinted at this earlier, but if you could go over, why you decided to do this particular book in verse.
I think the biggest thing was that when I was writing it for my grandmother, I was writing it in short chunks. And I started out writing larger chunks and I would send them to her either by email or by snail mail. And I think she was having a hard time reading them. So I printed them bigger and bigger and bigger because she loved her big print books and her big print crossword puzzles. And so I printed them bigger and bigger. But I at that point, the dementia had already kicked in. I think, she would read it and then she would forget it. So I thought writing it in verse would be a beautiful way to engage her on a much quicker level. So sometimes I would call her and I would read it to her. And then I'd be like, do you remember that? And she would be like, oh yeah, I remember that. And I think sometimes she was just saying that, but then sometimes I would hear this energy in her voice, like, and she would remember it and she would thank me for it. And she would thank me for bringing up the memory. And it was just such a nice way to engage with her. And it was short and sweet. I think it just needed to be short and sweet for her to be able to not get lost in the conversation.
And sometimes I think with the economy of language that is required with verse, it really pushes you right to the emotion. You think that may have helped as well?
I think so. I don't think I knew that consciously, but there's so many good books out there that are written in verse. I think of Brown Girl Dreaming, which is an amazing, amazing book. And I remember reading that and just being brought to tears at some points. And you're right. It gets straight to the emotion. I think that when you write in prose, there's so much more. There's so much more. Just there's more words, there's more story, there's more everything. But with verse, you're limited and you have to get straight to the point most of the time. And it's an exercise.
Yeah. When we spoke the last time, we talked about the resilience of young people in tough life situations. What would you share with a teen having similar experiences to those in your books?
Oh, this is always such a hard question because I always want to say it gets better, but for some people it doesn't get better.
Right.
And so I would say stay strong. I would say have hope. And both of those are easy to say, but much harder to live through, because staying strong when you're in an abusive situation is the most difficult thing in the world. And staying strong means different things to different people. For some, it means joining a gang. For others, it means selling drugs. But for others, it means, studying hard. It means fighting sometimes. So stay strong. I would say stay strong, but be hopeful, because you have to have hope that things are going to get better. I hope that they do for every kid out there. And there's so many kids living with abuse and living with trauma, and it's a sad state of the world, but it is a state of the world, and it's one that so many people are living through, and it's devastating to know. But I do hope that kids, and not just kids, but even young adults, know that if they work hard, 9 times out of 10, it's going to change things. They can move in a better direction. They can make better choices, and they can move towards hope, which is a very, very hard thing to hold on to sometimes.
And what would you like young people who have no experience with these kinds with this type of tough life experiences, what would you like for them to take away from the book?
Well, I would like them to take away a sense of empathy. There's so many kids and young adults and even adults living with trauma all around people that they either know or they don't know. And, that kid at school who is a bully, or that kid at school who's super quiet, or that kid at school who's super awkward, maybe they're going through something at home, and, rather than pick on them, or rather than ignore them, rather than treat them lesser than, they can embrace them. And I mean, we don't have to be hugging in the hallways, but
Right.
at the very least,
yeah, but the empathy is really what you describe. Yeah.
yeah, something as simple as a smile can change someone's day. And so I always encourage people to smile.
And we have another question from one of our from one of our virtual audience. Randall Roos wants to know, can you talk about writing fictional stories versus more autobiographical ones?
Yeah, well, when I was younger, I always thought that writing nonfiction would be easier. It turns out that's not the case. With fiction, you just make stuff up. And if something's not working, you can just change it. It's so hard to write nonfiction. It's one of the most difficult things I've ever done as a writer, because you're trying to be honest. And not only does that sometimes paint you in a bad light, and by you, I mean me, but it is also difficult because you want to write a narrative. You want to write a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you want there to be some kind of emotional arc. And it's so hard to do that with real life. It's so hard to figure out. I mean, with my stories, with all 3 books, it was very hard for me to figure out the beginning points and the end points. And so that was the most difficult part of the process. But also, just diving back into hard emotional trauma, it's very difficult, not just on the body, but on the mind and on the spirit. It's very taxing. It's very exhausting. When I write fiction, it's just, it flows out of me. It's so much easier. It doesn't hurt. It's not painful, because it's fiction. It's not real. And I think that my mind knows that. Whereas when I'm writing nonfiction, it's just, it's a process.
But do you think going through this process and your own particular journey, how has it informed the fiction, or has it in any way?
It has, actually. For years and years, I wrote fiction 100% of the time. I never wrote nonfiction, never thought to. And I was sending out my novels to agents and editors and publishers, trying to get anyone to publish my book. And ultimately, I got editors to give me notes, and the notes were, there's no emotional, plot, dialogue, action, so much about writing. They're like, but the one thing that's missing is emotion, the heart of the story. And I was like, well, how do I learn how to write that? And they're like, try writing nonfiction. And I was like, I don't write nonfiction. Like, that's not something I'm interested in. But I did it as an exercise, and it turned out to be, that's where Free Lunch came from. And it was one of the hardest things I ever wrote. But there's definitely a lot of heart in it. So writing nonfiction taught me how to write fiction much better.
Is there a particular reason, and I think we talked about this once with the second book, you have an amazing ability to maintain the voice of the young person that is, giving us the perspective of the young person. It's not a lot of like wonder years looking back and remembering, and, now you're wise beyond your years. You really maintain the voice of young Rex throughout. How are you managing to do that? And it happens in all of the books.
Yeah, I think that part of it is I'm very childish. I'm very mature. So I think that goes a long way. But I really, whenever I'm writing something that took place in the past, I very much try to engage that younger self. I go back and I remember the toys that I played with. I try to watch the movies that I watched as a kid. I listen to the music that I listened to at the time. I really try to put myself in that mindset. And I think it's all about voice too. Like I remembered how I talked as a kid, and I tried to put that dialogue in there, that vernacular. And it's not easy to do because I don't talk like that anymore. Well, so there's some things I say that are still the same, but I very much try to put myself in those shoes, and I try to engage with my younger self and really, really, really get in touch with that inner child and use that voice to write my books. And it's not always easy, but yeah, I think it's rewarding because the first time I wrote Free Lunch, I was writing it as an adult looking back, and it just didn't work. It wasn't the same thing. I was like, kids don't want to read this.
Right.
This is a book for adults. And I wanted to write a book for kids because there's so many kids on the free lunch program. And now with this, there's so many kids who have grandmothers and they have complex relationships with or loving relationships with. And so to engage them fully, I wanted to write in a voice that they could relate to.
And we have one more question, another question from Randall. Are you working on any new projects that you can share?
I'm working on a few projects. One of them is coming out from Scholastic Graphics. It's called Four Eyes, and it is about me getting glasses in sixth grade. It's very much a kind of a Disney version of my sixth grade experience. Free Lunch is the hard version, and then Four Eyes is going to be the light version. It's a graphic novel. It's much lighter. It's much more fun. Then the follow-up to Four Eyes is called Pizza Face, which is about going through puberty. And then the third one in that trilogy is called Weirdo, and it's about me figuring out my sexuality and my gender expression. But I'm also working on another prose book that essentially, Abuela, Don't Forget Me is very much an addition to a trilogy that's been in the works for a while, which was Free Lunch, Punching Bag, and then a book that I don't have a name for, but it's about my dad kicking me out for being gay and me being homeless for 3 months when I was 18. And if Free Lunch was hard to write and Punching Bag was 10 times harder, then this book is 10 times harder than Punching Bag. It's very difficult. Once again, writing nonfiction is the most difficult thing. And probably after I'm taking a break from writing it, but after I write that book, that's probably it for me for nonfiction, at least for a while.
Well, we only have a couple of more minutes, but I would like to ask you if you have advice for young people who want to write, particularly young people who may share some of the experiences that you've had or may not. What would you tell your younger self about writing from your experiences?
That's an excellent question. I would tell my younger self to make sure that he's engaging with all five senses, because that's so important when writing to an audience. It's very much like being telepathic. You're projecting your own thoughts and emotions and stories into someone else's brain. And to do that, sometimes the best way is to engage all five senses. And I try to do that in my book or in all my books, and to really paint a picture. But more than that, to be honest, just to really don't be afraid to go to the dark places. Don't be afraid to go to the hard places, just to be perfectly open. And it's so hard. It's so hard. If it's hard, you're probably doing something right. And also to never give up, because that's the easiest thing to do is you're writing something and it becomes difficult. You're like, I'm just going to put my pen down. I'm going to stop writing. And that's the wrong thing to do. If you want to write, you have to keep at it. You have to just keep going. And and you're going to get rejected a lot, and that's okay too. It doesn't mean you're bad or that you're bad at writing. It just means that nothing's perfect, and that's okay. Life is not perfect. And keep going. I guess I keep coming back to that because that's the most important part. Keep going.
Well, I think that there is a theme for all three of your books. It is keep going, and it is don't give up. Persevere, and give thanks for the people in your life that provide support, which you've certainly done with Abuela, Don't Forget Me. So it was terrific to talk to you again. I look forward to the books that you just spoke about that will be coming out, and wishing you nothing but the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the awesome questions. And just thank you for reading the book. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Oh, thanks to both of you for this really powerful conversation. And Rex, a special thanks to you for sharing Abuela with us. It's really terrific. So everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. And don't forget, you can still click the link in the chat box to get your copy of Abuela, Don't Forget Me, as well as Free Lunch and Punching Bag. As an independent bookstore, we appreciate your support. And I think that's it for this evening. Thank you again, everyone, for